Okay, I think we're good to know. I saw that we were broadcasting. So I will start. My name is Cassy Dorff. I'm an assistant professor at Vanderbilt University, and I am a co-coordinator of the online Peace Science Colloquium, which you are at, the OPSC. I run this with my co-coordinator, Brad Smith, who's also an assistant professor at Vanderbilt. Let me give a quick overview about the OPSC. We started in 2015. We're great. We're all about helping excellent research and conversations continue before and after the Peace Science Society meetings. So that's what we do. We also try to bring these kinds of conversations to a broader audience online. So you'll be able to find this talk later posted to our website, which if you just go to peacescience.edu/colloquia or click on the Colloquia tab, you can find more information about this talk as well as watch it. So today I'm really excited for this group. We have Dr. Cyanne Loyle, who is going to be presenting her paper, Laws and Order, the Impact of Rebel Governance on Post-Conflict Rule of Law. We also have three wonderful discussants, Beth Altier, Michael Weintraub, and Adrian Florea. And that's that for my introductions. I will keep it brief. And now I'll turn it over to Cyanne, who has about 15 minutes to give her presentations, and then we'll try to get a discussion going. Last thing I'll say is that if you are attending this and watching and tuning in and you want to post a question, you can post it under the Q&A tab. I'll check it out. If we have time, I'll work it into the discussion. If not, I will send those over to Cyanne so she has some additional feedback. All right, Cyanne, we're ready when you are.
Great, thanks so much. I am going to share my screen as per the plan. Well, I just wanted to thank everybody for tuning in today or for watching later, and to say, though, Cassy asked me to say it at the end, I'll say it right at the beginning. This is the first cut of a new project with some new data, and so I'm really excited and enthusiastic to receive feedback from Beth and Adrian and Michael, but also from anyone else in the Peace Science community that would like to share some feedback with me. I am Cyanne Loyle. I'm at Penn State and a Global Fellow at the Peace Research Institute of Oslo. And most of the work that I have done on issues of judiciaries and transitional justice to date has focused really on during conflict or post-conflict justice processes. So I came at this question originally with a focus on government institutions. I then had the opportunity, using some data that I collected with Helga Binningsbo at PRIO, to start to think about the rebel use of these processes. So when do rebels use transitional justice or judicial processes during armed conflict? And that was a paper that has just recently come out in the Journal of Conflict Resolution, and I kind of thought through the mechanisms in which we would be most likely to see these processes used by rebel groups. But ultimately, I found that question a little bit unsatisfying because the use or misuse or lack of use of these processes didn't really help me understand some of the post-conflict outcomes that I was interested in. And so at the end of that paper, I promised some future research, and this is in fact the future research that I promised to start thinking about. And so the research question that I've been digging into a lot more recently is the long-term impacts of rebel judicial systems on other types of post-conflict outcomes, particularly the post-conflict judiciary. So when we think about rebel judiciaries or rebel courts, there's a broad range of institutional outcomes or processes that end up in that category. So ultimately, I'm thinking in this project about everything from Maoist people's courts in Nepal to ad hoc kind of codified executions that take place in places like Angola under UNITA, as well as Islamist courts in Afghanistan. And so there's I'm happy to talk about the variety of different things that kind of end up in this category. But when we think about rebel judiciaries, they're not an uncommon form of rebel governance. About 28% of rebel groups adopt courts during civil wars, according to Rachel Hung's data. And then in the data that Helga and I have, there's about 10% of rebel groups that use court systems or judiciaries, and that's because we have a much lower battle death threshold. When we think about rebel judiciaries, there's a huge amount of variation, as I mentioned. So some of the variation that I've paid attention to is things like the level of codification of rebel courts. So whether or not there's a firm set of rules that rebels are using with which to adjudicate different disputes versus kind of these ad hoc tribunals, like I mentioned in the Angola case. There's variation in terms of the procedures that are used. So judges, juries, whether or not it's just rebel cadre the types of crimes that go through these judiciaries. So we can think about things like Sharia courts, but we can also think about courts that deal with things like domestic abuse. The IRA in Northern Ireland punished a lot of antisocial behavior. There's also extreme variations in terms of punishment, with everything from being ostracized from a community or a rebel group all the way up through execution. There's also some pretty significant variation in levels of participation. And we can think about this either in terms of buy-in, so how much community engages or supports the process, but we can also think about this in terms of the ways that the structures are set up to allow for community members to participate. So for example, in some of the Afghanistan cases and some of the Ethiopian cases, there's examples of rebel groups trying to co-opt local tribal structures or existing judicial structures, and those usually have a lot of kind of pre-existing buy-in, or they have a lot of local participation already built into them. There's also examples of just kind of straight up rebel courts that are only accessible to rebel members. And then along with this variation, there's a predictable variation in terms of the capacity of these courts and their legitimacy. So capacity, just how able they are to function, the reach of the courts, whether they are accessible outside of rebel-held territory or not. And then legitimacy is its own can of worms, but just the degree to which people are kind of respecting or buying into these outcomes. So I'll talk a little bit about the data I collected in a second to actually test some of the hypotheses, but I just finished in August with a team of research assistants here at Penn State collecting a new rebel courts data set. And that's given me the opportunity to actually start to address this research question that I'm interested in. And so I'm at the very early stages of thinking through what I'm calling some of the mechanisms of impact. So thinking about the ways in which we should expect rebel governance institutions to actually have post-conflict outcome or influence. Reiko's book has been particularly influential in my thinking about this. She outlines learning mechanisms that help her understand the ways in which rebel governance impacts democratic outcomes, of which I think the strength of the judiciary is an important one. So when we think about learning mechanisms, there's kind of three ways we can think about this. So I have some theoretical implications in terms of skills transfer. So by engaging or interacting with rebel courts, you may learn skills that will be useful for the post-conflict judiciary later on. You may have a heightened level of expectation for rule of law. So when you watch a process function, you may learn things about how you want systems of law to function. And then in learning that, you may be able to mobilize and put pressure on a post-conflict government to actually help fulfill those expectations. And we'd expect these learning mechanisms to kind of impact three levels of actors, right? The rebels themselves, depending on how they interact or engage with the court process, the citizens that have some sort of exposure to the rebel court process, whether they be under rebel control or just have access to the rebel courts, and then likely the state judiciary, both during and after conflict, which is going to be susceptible to this level of political pressure. And so that leads me to kind of my overarching hypothesis. I drill down and focus specifically on rule of law here, but ultimately I think we can apply this to other measures of kind of judicial success in a post-conflict judiciary. But I make the argument that having rebel judiciaries should lead to higher levels of post-conflict rule of law. Now, this is where a number of members of the audience bristle and say, well, wait a second, you put a lot of things in the category of rebel courts that should not expect us to have positive post-conflict outcomes, like higher levels of rule of law. And that's absolutely right. So there are three ways that I think we should expect to see some variation in this process, with the obviously huge caveat that many rebel courts don't adhere to the types of rule of law measures that we would capture in BDEM, which is ultimately what I try to measure in the analysis. So the first thing would be level of judicial codification. And that is to say that I think rebel rules matter. Not just having rules, but having those rules be transparent. So having members of the community actually understand what the crimes are that are being punished, how that punishment is happening, how the procedures function, because we're not going to develop a respect for rule of law if we're not watching some of these rules kind of enacted through the rebel court system. The second variation I think is going to be important is level of civilian influence. And so here I'm talking about the degree to which there are actually civilians or non-rebels involved in some way in the judicial process. This is going to be important for my learning mechanism because these civilians are going to be able to kind of learn through their interactions, not just by attending the courts, but through actually participating as either members of juries or judges in some of the functionings of the courts. And last but certainly not least is the importance of community engagement. This is if rebels hold a court and nobody shows up, does it actually matter? And so the community engagement measure for me is about whether or not people are seeing these things happen. So there are a number of rebel courts in my data where rebels are trying people, but they're either doing it privately or they're doing it where nobody's actually showing up to watch those trials. And if that happens, I don't think we're going to have the same learning effect as we would if there were high levels of community engagement. I do want to pause here and give my own two finger and say that community engagement should not be understood as a proxy for legitimacy, because there's a number of different reasons why people would show up at rebel courts that do not map on in any way to an effective measure of legitimacy, specifically high levels of coercion. So rebels can compel people to attend their judicial proceedings without people actually wanting to be there in the first place. Now at this stage, I'm a little bit less concerned about that because I'm really just interested in the learning mechanisms that would go on if people show up and are watching how the trials proceed. But certainly, as I move forward and start to think about how to conceptualize legitimacy, the legitimacy of the courts is going to be an important piece for me, and community engagement as a variable is not getting us there. All right, so I previewed it a little bit, but let me just talk briefly about the rebel courts data. Over the summer, again, with the help of a team of research assistants, collected data on 63 different rebel legal systems from 1946 through 2006. Here I'm defining courts as kind of a governance institution that has some sort of authority to either judge or adjudicate disputes or crimes. So I have a relatively broad definition for how I think about these institutions, and that does lead itself to some real variation in terms of the types of systems that are captured. I am using UCDP as my unit of, as my kind of universe of cases, and then draw very heavily on Reiko's work, Reiko Wong's work, the During Conflict Justice data set that I coded with PRIO, as well as Karen Albert's new data set to help me think through the rebel groups that are most likely to use legal systems, right? So all of the cases that they code in those data are also included in mine. I mentioned it, but judicial codification for me is a measure of whether or not there are rebel rules. Civilian influence is whether or not there's evidence that civilians are present in some way in the process. This is most common as civilians that are judges for rebel courts or civilians that serve as juries. And community engagement is, again, a thumbs up or a thumbs down as to whether or not there's evidence of people actually showing up to the process. There's variation across all of these variables, and I have the breakdowns for that in the paper. I just want to flag that there's a bunch of other information that I've collected in the narratives for each of these rebel courts, and the data is not fully coded up yet. So there's no actual data set. I'm just kind of saying kind of case narratives at this point. So there's a lot of different, certainly be open to different conceptualizations of some of these variables or thoughts on other things that would be useful. So additional things that we have collected information on is things like court structure, the level of sophistication. We talked about crimes and punishments, the types of people that are targeted, or the groups of people that are targeted through these courts. I try to get a little bit closer to legitimacy by thinking about community buy-in. And then I also have some interesting information on the relationship of these courts to the state system. So that is all coming your way soon, but it right now is just in a series of really fascinating case narratives for these 63 different legal systems. All right, so my preliminary analysis is pretty lame, and I have told all the discussants that ahead of time, and that's a product of the fact that I'm still trying to figure out exactly how I want to model this and what I want it to look like, but this wouldn't be a peace science presentation if I didn't actually throw some stuff up on the slide for you. So this is two super basic OLS models that help to think about the relationship between rebel courts and post-conflict rule of law as measured by VDEM. So this is the 5-year average of VDEM for these countries, and what I am finding so far is that rebel courts do have an impact, as well as the civilian influence variable, which lends some support to my influence for my learning mechanism, but I still need to think a little bit about the reasons that kind of rules are not pulling in the way that I want them to. The same thing with community engagement. Post-conflict rule of law, or sorry, pre-conflict rule of law is another significant predictor, which we would not be surprised at. And so I've been experimenting with a bunch of kind of funkier modeling strategies to help me think about the change in pre-conflict and post-conflict rule of law based on rebel courts. All right, I promised Cassy I wasn't going to go over, so let me just do my super quick wrap-up slide. As I mentioned, there's a bunch of things I'm thinking about as I continue with this project. capacity and legitimacy indicators and making sure that they get in the model are important to me. The during conflict judicial activity of states is actually something that I have some data on, but I don't have that in the model. And with Efi Trukdem at Bilkent in Turkey, this month we're running a survey, a nationwide survey, but I have an oversampling in the Kurdish regions of Turkey to ask about experiences under PKK rule. And this is allowing me to ask specific questions about rulemaking, whether or not those rules were transparent, and then some other indicators about kind of life under PKK governance, which I hope is going to inform this paper a little bit more. To rehash, this is the first time I have presented this paper, and so I'm really grateful for the opportunity for any sort of feedback. I'm particularly interested in thoughts about the data because we haven't coded it yet. And so usually when you are commenting on people's data, the first thing they say is, I can't change anything, so don't reconceptualize my variables. I can change everything. And so I'm at a really interesting point in this process to think about both theory, data, and methods for the project. So with that, I will stop sharing my screen and I look forward to all your comments.
Thank you so much. We clap for you. Appreciate it. And we'll hear from our discussants first. I think we'll have Adrian first.
All right. Thank you very much for inviting me to contribute to the symposium. And thanks to Cyanne for sharing with us her fascinating project. It's great to see people collecting more data on rebels and conducting empirical analysis. So we're looking forward to future publications from Cyanne. I'll try to be very brief because we were advised to provide our main critical comment if you wish. But before doing so, I'll just say that the project does contribute to our understanding of not only rebel governance, but also post-conflict stability or peace, if you wish. Cyanne argues that post-conflict rule of law has wartime origins related to the ways in which rebels institutionalize their rule in the territory that they controlled, and she builds on Reiko's work to posit a learning mechanism according to which rebels learn dispute adjudication processes during war and then implement them at the end of the war. My main comment refers to a possible selection effect that can have both theoretical and empirical implications. In other words, I would encourage Cyanne to think about some factors that are related both to the initial establishment of rebel judicial institutions and also to the patterns of the rule of law that we observe in the post-conflict environment. So one of them that came to mind was ideology, all right? Rebels institutionalize their rule. They embark upon adjudicating disputes among the population living in the territory that they can control for different reasons. To coerce the population, perhaps to respond to pressures from the community. And the establishment of a judicial process can also be driven by multiple factors that also could potentially relate to the post-conflict rule of law. One of them is ideology. For example, Marxist rebels could establish those kind of judicial institutions at a higher rate compared to non-Marxist rebels. Religious-driven ideologies can influence the establishment of rebel courts, whether they are codified or not. For example, nationalist rebels could also exhibit different variation in the type of institutions that they established, judicial institutions. So ideology would be, I think, a factor that could determine both the establishment of rebel judiciaries in the first place, but also in the type of the rule of law that we observe in the post-conflict environment. Another one relates to the time horizons of rebels and factors that relate to the time horizons of rebels, such as the goal of a rebellion, which is there in the empirical results. Secessionist rebels, there's a binary variable over there. Arguably, secessionist rebels will have longer time horizons, and therefore they will be greater incentivized to establish institutions in the first place, and perhaps to implement the rule of law in the aftermath of the conflict. But also the extent of territorial control. It was not clear to me whether all of the rebels coded exercise territorial control. Obviously, territorial control can affect the degree of codification, judicial codification, the extent to which we observe community engagement, or even the extent to which civilians have an opportunity to engage into rebel judicial procedures. Another factor that can affect the time horizons would be the resource endowments of rebels, right? Which could permeate in the conflict environment. So the bottom line, and I'll stop here because I need to be brief, perhaps both theoretically and empirically, a selection effect could operate here, whereby some factors that are related to the establishment of rebel judicial institutions in the first place are also shaping the post-conflict rule of law. Empirically, obviously, this would mean running a selection model, perhaps a two-stage segment or something along those lines. I have other comments, but I'll stop here for the sake of brevity. Thanks.
Okay, great. So I echo Adrian's concern. So I was thinking a little bit about selection effects, but I'm going to talk about some other things. So I just want to echo Adrian's point too, that this is a really interesting research agenda. I found it a fascinating paper to read, and I'm really looking forward to see where this all goes. So the first thing I just thought of when I was reading the papers, you start with this really fascinating example of ISIS, and you seem to insinuate that the ISIS governance structures or the judiciary there maybe had a negative impact on the post-conflict judicial system or the rule of law. And so I guess it kind of leaves the reader when you get to the end of the paper with this puzzle of, you show very nicely what positive impacts, that the civilian influence can have a positive impact on post-conflict rule of law. But it left me wondering, well, when or what context does it have a negative impact? And so I know that's something you're thinking about looking at, but it just, because it starts with that, by the end of the paper, I kind of am left wondering, like, okay, well, what explains that case? I also thought maybe related to that, it might be interesting to look at who wins the conflict and if that has an impact, right? So if the rebels, for instance, are completely defeated, if they're part of a negotiated settlement, that might affect the outcome. I also thought on page 6, you discuss community buy-in, and I'm not sure, I get the sense that that's a little bit different from community engagement, because on page 6, you say community buy-in is shaped by the type of the judiciary, whether it's fair or non-biased. And so I always think, Northern Ireland's the case I know best, I think so, in thinking about that case, when I think about community buy-in, it wasn't really shaped by whether it was fair, but it was shaped by whether it was perceived as fair vis-a-vis the alternatives, or whether it was just a better the only alternative, essentially. And so I think it's important when you're looking at buy-in to not just look at whether it's fair or impartial, but what options do people have? And so I guess that actually gets to my third comment, but in some parts of Northern Ireland, for instance, people had options, right? And so it wasn't perceived as fair, even, let's say in nationalist areas by Catholics. But in other places, it was perceived as sort of, there was community buy-in, and it wasn't perceived as fair, but it was like, okay, well, this is sort of the only option that we have. Let's see. Yeah, so I think the spatial impact, if you could just think maybe a little bit, it'd be really interesting. I don't know if you can get the data, but even if you could just look within a conflict spatially and just see how, I think it would also help you sort of elucidate the mechanisms at work, these learning mechanisms that you discuss, right? See if that's what's actually going on. And then I guess that sort of relates to the next point, which is, I guess I'm wondering at the national level, right, you have this sort of process happening, but what's happening, I guess what I see in Northern Ireland, for instance, is that, and I don't know how that case is coded in your data, but there did seem to be improvements in the rule of law over time at the national level, right, or at the aggregate level. But what I see still happening there, in fieldwork and whatnot, is that these rebel governance systems are still operating, right? So you could have this improvement at the national level, but at the sort of local level, it's not improved in certain areas, if that makes sense.
It doesn't. Go explain it to me one more time.
Okay, yeah. So for instance, okay, so your measures are all at the aggregate level, right? And so when I look at a place like Northern Ireland, the places where the rebel judiciaries were operating, right? Those certain communities, right? So they were only operating in certain communities. And in those communities where they're operating, you could make the argument that post-conflict rule of law in those communities is unchanged, or maybe not better necessarily, because people, for instance, in Northern Ireland, in those communities, still won't report information to the police. They still believe the police are biased. Police still won't go into certain communities. I realize I'm talking about police and not judiciaries, but those things actually never make it up to the judiciary. So they'll still report things in both Loyalist and Republican communities. And so even though at the national level, maybe you see this relationship, I'm wondering, like at that local level, you could have a situation where institutionally, right, you know, people perceive like the institutions are better, but in these communities where the rebel judiciaries actually are and are functioning, you know, they're not actually perceived as better. And so I guess that kind of, for me, challenges that learning mechanism, because I don't feel like people are actually learning, I guess, if that makes sense. And I guess that also gets the another question I have is, like, again, because I focus on developed democracies, is it, you know, I could see it operating very clearly in a weak state, right? But I'm wondering in a state where, and obviously there are problems with the judiciary in Northern Ireland and institutions, not, you know, never was a perfect system. But I guess I'm wondering, right, they're starting from already a certain level, right? And so how much are they actually learning, right? They know how these systems are supposed to operate already. They see that they're not operating the way that they are. And so I'm wondering if the learning mechanism operates in the same way in a developed democracy. I hope that made sense. And then I guess my last question was, you know, I was sort of thinking about a reviewer, right? And this is not something I would say, but a reviewer, if this, you know, when this is being reviewed. So you have 14.7% of cases have this rebel judicial process. And so I can very easily see a reviewer saying, well, why should we care? This is a small number of cases. We can't really change how rebels, you know, what judicial processes they seek to employ, right? And so why should we care? Like, what is the effect on policy? We can't change what they're doing, right? And so I think if you can find like an angle to say why a policymaker or practitioner would care about this, then it would better, I mean, for me, like, I'm completely on board. I think this is wonderful, but for them, I think they would see additional value in it. But anyway, I think it's a great paper so far.
Great. So thanks so much to Cyanne for giving us the opportunity to read and discuss her paper. It's a mixed blessing to come after Adrian and Mary Beth, because some of the things that I was going to say have already been said, which is actually, it's probably good. So Cyanne, so you say that the literature on rebel governance, quote, often overlooks or fails to directly investigate the ability of rebel groups to make and enforce rules during conflict. So I agree. But that tells me that the first question that we should be asking is about the short-term effects of rebel judicial institutions before we ask about long-term effects. Put differently, I think that establishing that these institutions are causally consequential in the short term, that they produce changes in behavior at all, is probably necessary if insufficient condition for establishing their long-term effects. And I think the literature hasn't done that yet, and that's probably like something that we have to do first. Second, I wanted to see a lot more engagement with the literature on learning. So what kinds of lessons are generally learned in politics, especially in these kinds of uncertain environments, under what kinds of conditions? Your theoretical argument basically seems to imply that all individuals learn the same lessons, yet we know that that isn't true. And in particular, you say, quote, the learning mechanism is likely impacted by the degree to which civilians are able to interact with or influence rebel judiciary. So yeah, again, I agree, but it isn't clear why, even if civilians learned lessons from those experiences, and as you say, this increases their desire for transparent judicial outcomes, this actually translates later into transparent judicial outcomes in the post-conflict. That is, what's the process by which civilian opinions translate into changes in the judicial system? One of the insights from the literature on learning in IR, here I'm thinking about work by Jack Levy and Andy Bennett that was actually like post-Cold War kind of literature, is that an individual must be in a position of power for learning to be consequential. I mean, everybody can learn lessons. But what matters for us, for students of politics, is if those lessons are learned by people who are in power. And so we need to know much more about how civilians' lessons learned become embedded in institutional structures of power that would allow for those lessons learned to have a transformative effect on state institutions. And I think you go and you can go way beyond Reiko Huang. You know, her book is great, but like I think you need to sell your theoretical contribution as going far beyond Reiko's fantastic book. Okay, so 3, you talk about variations in legitimacy as one dimension of rebel judiciary strategies, but I would have preferred something a bit more concrete that didn't rely on this relationship between communities and the courts to do the heavy lifting here. So in this concept of legitimacy, you include what seems to be everything from transparent, well-codified processes to the extent to which these trials were intended to serve warfighting ends, to the extent to which communities themselves view these trials as reflecting community values. And here I just worry about using a relational concept because it's nearly impossible to reconstruct community perceptions about these rules across time and space. So I just pare this back in your discussion, your theoretical discussion, and focus in the discussion of the theory section, at least, on transparent rules and procedures, which is much, much easier to grasp as a theoretical concept and much easier to measure. Just a couple of comments about the empirical section. So you say that 63 out of 426 conflict dyads include a rebel judicial process, but in how many separate countries did this behavior occur? In other words, how much are your results being driven by a few countries where these rebel judicial processes might be spatially clustered? And I think that raises like a broader point about interdependence among cases here, both on a theoretical level, like how much do rebels within a single country learn from each other when they're thinking about setting up or adapting the institutional mechanisms that they use to interact with civilians, but also statistically, like, your dependent variable is measured at the country level, but your independent variable is essentially a property of one of the members of the dyad, which is the rebel group, right? And so how should we think about this? Like statistically, there are clear violations of what we think about as stable unit treatment value assumption, where the assignment to treatment of one unit depends upon the assignment to treatment of another unit. And just thinking about like clustered error terms, there are like a ton of interesting, I think, theoretical and econometric kind of things that I think you need to discuss and deal with that I don't yet see in the paper. Two maybe final points about the empirical section, then we'll open it. I want to know something about substantive effect sizes, like how does the improvement of the rule of law that you attribute to rebel judicial strategies compare to the effect sizes of like other things that we care about, like some of the other right-hand variables that you have in your models. Given work by Megan Stewart, among others, this kind of ties into something that Adrian said. I'd expect that the effect of rebel institutions would depend upon whether a group has secessionist goals or not, which actually suggests that maybe you should look at the interaction between secessionist conflicts as opposed to just like treating it as a nuisance, so controlling for it on the right-hand side. And then finally, and definitely not least, I think in the empirical section, somehow we need evidence for the learning mechanism. Whether it be qualitative, which would be totally fine and great, and I think most of us would be happy with that, or think about some clever way to tease out some observable implications of the theory that could be tested quantitatively, and maybe that's like a place where we could spend some time during the discussion today. That's all I've got for now, and I'll send you more comments later, Cyanne. Thanks.
Thanks so much to all of you. I'm going to jump in real quick to also just say to anyone who's tuning in, if you'd like to leave a question for Cyanne, please put it in the little Q&A box that you can use, and I'll check it out, throw it into our discussion if there's room, and if not, she'll get all of those comments when we're done. So Cyanne, if you'd like to respond, and we can get a discussion going on some of these great points.
Great. Well, thank you all so much for these very useful comments, and all very well received and right at the right time. Adrian, I've thought a lot about selection effects, so this is something that I need to think about both theoretically and empirically. I think that you're right. Mary Beth, I thank you for repeating that comment that I asked you to re-articulate. It got me thinking a lot about Kit Rickards and Kirsten Baki's work on Northern Ireland. So they've got some great stuff. I don't know that any of it's out yet, where they're trying to look at exactly the spatial variation in that case. And so I know the work, I've engaged with it a little bit. I don't have spatially varying data. And the closest we've got, so Karen Albert's stuff now is time varying, which is useful, but I think that spatially varying is the next big step. I'm hoping, and some of the cases that I have are a little bit easy to do that with, right? So Turkey's a really easy case when it comes to looking at spatial variation, but it's a well-received point. I'll think a little bit more about that. I also totally take your point of why should we care? And so does the NSF, by the way, as of August. In terms of number of cases of rebel courts. And so it's one of those problems where it's like so intuitively cool to me that I still need to figure out how to make sure that it's intuitively cool to other people. I also think that rule of law is really important.
I think it's cool. I think it's cool. I just think someone might say that. I could see that happening.
No, and someone in fact has, right? So, but I think that these post-conflict outcomes are incredibly important. And I think Adrian set it up nicely by saying that we know that war processes impact these post-conflict institutional outcomes. And, but yeah, I don't know that we are super good at knowing exactly how that all works. And so that's part of the intervention I want to kind of inject myself into. Michael, I take all of your comments, and including all of the empirical comments, very seriously, and I need to think a little bit more about that. And I'm not at modeling yet, so expect some follow-up emails where we can play this out a little bit more. The short-term effect question is a great one, because yeah, I think that's a really good point too, right? Do we know that these things actually do anything on the ground? So let me think about that. Power is important. I know that. I don't know. Great comment. I'm going to stop there. These are brilliant comments. Let me get more comments. I'll stop talking.
Yeah, do any of y'all want to pick up on any of those threads, say a bit more, or offer other comments that you held back on? Yeah, Mary.
Yeah, I was just going to say, I mean, even if you can't get spatial variation, you might be able to tease some of that out, like just through controlled case studies spatially, you know, even if you can't get quantitative data, you know, just building on Michael's point, I agree. Like, I think just having a case study that shows that mechanism would be really impactful in terms of, you know, helping the paper.
And I've been working with Michael Rubin on trying to get spatially variated data on rebel courts in Nepal. So the People's Courts in Nepal is a great place to start to look at that. We still have not been able to find the level of data that we want granularly. So if anybody out there in the universe has variation on Nepalese governance data, that would be super useful. Because the People's Courts had slightly more fixed locations, though they were still mobile, that's one of the places that we've been looking. But if anybody has a great case for that, I'd certainly take that in the Q&A.
Maybe I'll just jump in and kind of think a little bit about selection or endogeneity, because they're basically two sides of the same coin. And so one thing I was thinking of, I haven't yet read your piece with Helga, and Helga is one of my co-authors, so I feel very guilty saying that publicly. But like, I'd love to hear about why we see variation of rebel judicial strategy. And I think, you know, this is most consequential for, I think it's your hypothesis number 2, when you talk about these well-codified and transparent institutions, increasing awareness for and demand for post-conflict reforms. And so it could be the case that like rebels adopt these transparent rules in places that already have like socially shared expectations of transparency and decision-making. And for me, so I think for sure you're going to need a section on endogeneity/selection. One is maybe the issue that Adrian raised, but another is just like this, taking whatever insights come out of your paper with Helga to help us understand why some rebels are just like seem to be better at like procedural legitimacy, like what Tyler calls procedural legitimacy is like transparent decision making that tends to produce unbiased decisions. And it would be great for you to be able to say that, like, you know, maybe there isn't like random variation across space, but it's orthogonal, like it's orthogonal to local traditions of biased or unbiased decision making. Like, it's not as though civilians demand a certain kind of decision making locally that then rebels respond to and implement. Because if that's true, then there is this endogeneity issue is a problem for you. If rebels are much more authoritarian and say, you know, I don't care what local civilians think, I'm going to implement the kind of courts that I think are best for, you know, my warfighting aims. Actually, that helps you in terms of at least this endogeneity issue, right? Because then you can say, like, it's not about underlying cultural, social, economic, political kind of characteristics that would both predict selection into these particular kinds of judicial courts, and then would predict selection into better post-war outcomes. I don't know if that makes sense, Cyanne.
It does. The answer is all of the above. So let me first jump in. The Rebel Courts paper is not with Helga. She would be horrified to think that she had written a paper on Rebel Courts. It is not, in fact. What Helga and I have the paper on government processes during conflict. So that's the release of the During Conflict Justice data set. So you're not missing anything. Don't worry. You're completely caught up on your co-author's work. Helga would be horrified to think that she had participated in this project. For a variety of different reasons. And then the answer to your question in terms of kind of these predispositions within communities is all of the above, right? So there's a lot of variation in terms of the types of social structures in which these courts emerge from. Some, for example, like the co-optation of existing tribal processes, are where rebels capitalize on longstanding histories of kind of dispute resolution. But there's a lot of daylight between that and other types of courts, right? So there's some examples in the data set that I think are straight up examples of kind of international diffusion, right? So rebel groups that want to look like they're adhering to international humanitarian law or standards of law. The UNITA case is a bizarro one for me because they actually create a truth commission at one point, which is what I talk a little bit about in the JCR paper. Which is not a truth commission at all, but they just kind of want to say that they have a truth commission, right? And they run it. So there's some interesting things to say about when rebel groups just want to look like they're doing things that states do, and that doesn't, Adrian, to your point, map onto secessionist groups, right? There's some variation there too. So I can certainly kind of tease out these patterns more. But there is not one mold, right? There's not even a predominant mold when you look across the 63 cases.
If I could say just a few words here, I think a common refrain throughout all these comments is that perhaps an analysis of the establishment of rebel institutions in the first place is needed before we understand how they impact the post-conflict environment, right? Correct me if I'm wrong, but a benign view of rebel judiciary seems to permeate your discussion. And while these rebel courts may have been established, or at least in some stages, right? Again, I may have read this differently. Whereas some rebel courts are indeed established with a view to ruling the population perhaps in a more democratic way. In most other cases of rebellions, courts are set up in order to eliminate competitor, coerce the civilian population, and so on. These processes are obviously are likely to have a direct impact on the post-conflict environment as well, because the same learning mechanism we see with these coercive practices, one could argue, could also be visible in the post-conflict environment. So one other point I wanted to raise was how about informal institutions of dispute adjudication? Do you include also informal mechanisms such as Sharia courts that we see across many rebel groups in the Middle East and North Africa, or elders tribunals and so on, like we observe, for example, in Puntland? And is there a learning mechanism there also operating? And finally, I would encourage you to think, what would be an alternative mechanism operating that produces the observed outcome, right? Is it really the learning that I was seeing here, or perhaps a different kind of mechanism that helps us understand the variation in the post-conflict rule of law?
So let me just jump in to say that if anyone has perceived me as interpreting these institutions as benign, then that is a massive flaw of the writing of this draft of the paper. So no, I mean, most of my writing on state institutions also talks about the coercive nature of the judiciary, particularly during conflict, right? So I do not think they're benign institutions. And that goes back, I think, to Mary Beth's point as to whether or not there's a way to tease out these two different pathways, right? So should we always be expecting positive outcomes? In many ways, I don't think that we should, right? I think that part of my additional hypotheses is kind of teasing out the conditions and the mechanisms under which we would expect there to be a positive outcome on the rule of law. Your questions about elder tribunals and informal institutions, that's an interesting coding strategy. And in this version of the paper, I end up with a much more conservative coding, but I do have within the narrative documents that I've collected kind of both versions. And so I need to think a little bit about, as I move forward, how to do that. What has ended up in this version of the data that you have seen is when there's evidence that the rebels have kind of are setting up and controlling the process in a way that is much more their own. So there are a number of examples of Sharia courts that fall under rebel authority, right? So the rebels are actually running those courts. In that case, they have a pre-existing body of law that they're drawing on, but it is a transparent and relatively codified body of law. So that would be coded as a rebel court, and it would be coded as having rules.
Yeah, sorry if I could interject here. In some rebel-held areas, Sharia courts are operating under nominal rebel rule, but not directly by the rebels. So how would you code those? That's what I meant by informal institutions in rebel-controlled territory that are not under the direct control of the rebels, but they do operate in that area.
So I have data on them. They're not included in this analysis. So that's another good point, right? So are there, in rebel-held territory, there are alternative mechanisms of dispute resolution that are not being controlled by either the state or the rebel group, right? So in many cases where I have data on that, but I didn't set out to collect data on informal institutions.
Thanks.
I will pause.
Cyanne, can I just ask a descriptive question? So just about the spatial concentration of these institutions. So do they cluster in space? In other words, are there a few conflicts that feature a lot of them on the one hand, and do they tend to appear principally in a single region on the other hand?
They do not appear principally in a single region. They cluster along ideology when we talk about diffusion in exactly the way that Adrian suggested that they did, right? So the Marxist organizations as well as Islamist organizations are more likely to use these institutions. And there are a handful of conflicts, but that drive some of there are a handful of countries that drive some of the process, but it's not overwhelming. So Afghanistan and India are two that have high levels of rebel courts. But in both of those cases, it's 3 or 4 rebel groups. It's not 10 or 15. So I think you're right. It's something that I need to think about from a modeling perspective, but there was nothing that jumped out at me from the data as crazy. The other interesting variation that pops up is not just secessionist conflicts, but countries that adopt pre-existing institutions. So we have weird ones in there in terms of kind of Biafra, Croatia, Serbia, some of the other former Soviet satellite states where there are secessionist groups that kind of take over really firmly codified state institutions as their own. And so those are another weird one for me in terms of kind of what's actually going on there. And Adrian, I'm sure you've got some thoughts on those, but that's the other extreme in terms of you've got taking people out back in kangaroo courts and shooting them all the way up to really substantially codified judiciaries.
So do you think it's sorry to jump in again, but do you think like it's the same thing to build on top of the existing institutions and co-opt them versus create them from scratch? I mean, in terms of their likely effects on your outcome of interest?
No, but I don't know that we know enough yet to know, right? So I've got to take a bite of something, right? So I'm sure all these things do different things, but I don't know that they do different things as substantially as you think they do. In terms of, I'll plug my JCR paper. So in thinking through the types of places where we're more likely to see rebel courts, that's it doesn't directly get at this question because I look at all sorts of judicial processes, including the likelihood of amnesties and truth commissions and things like that. But in that paper, I find that kind of war fighting aims are a pretty strong predictor for rebel courts. So when I control for things like ideology or secessionist aims, it tends to be mobilization strategy that helps to determine the type of process that's most likely to be put in place. So whether there are more coercive processes or more conciliatory processes when it comes to things like granting amnesty or truth commissions. So it doesn't map onto, it maps onto exactly what we think it should map onto, which is the rebels' desire to win the conflict.
have another quick comment, if I may. I would also encourage you to perhaps clarify the mapping of the concepts into the indicators that you're using. You know, I love your conceptual definitions, for example, for civilian influence, for community engagement. I understand how they are different, for judicial codification. But then when I got to the indicators, to the measurement, especially for judicial codification in the paper, especially in the case studies, you discuss it in terms of the extent, degree, and then we have a binary in indicator. Do you have alternative measures for that? Because I think that would provide a much more fine-grained analysis of what we're seeing in terms of results in the outcomes observed.
Yeah, and I'm happy to talk about that because again, I've got the case narratives, and so how we want to conceptualize it is still an open process. And so that's what I've been playing a lot with this month, now that the data is done, is reading through all of the case narratives and figuring out exactly what these categories and categorizations look like. So, so ultimately, it's going to be a scale, right? Would be my guess, in terms of even in terms of rules, right? So, to get at some of the variation that Michael was interested in, right? Pre-existing rules versus new rules. I mean, I can include all of that from the data.
Great, thanks.
I was just thinking too, in terms of your variables for judicial codification, you know, having you know, a measure of whether those rules are followed or not, you know, the extent to which the group follows them or not would be important. And also, again, just, you know, not to beat a dead horse, but there is spatial variation in that. There's also spatial variation in codification, which I'm sure you're aware of, you know, even within countries. So, you know, different units of a rebel group might have different levels of codification and follow them to different extents. And then, I'm sorry.
I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, go ahead.
It also gets really interesting in terms of capacity, right? So, and part of the problem I've had with the following of rules, so I get to ask some of these questions on my Turkey survey, so I'm really excited about that. But when it comes to some of the following of the rules, you also can't separate that out between choosing to follow the rules and being coerced to follow the rules, even in the anthropological literature. So I've, a lot of in order to kind of write up these case narratives, we relied on a lot of kind of anthropological texts about these rebel groups, and even the anthropologists who are hanging out on the ground are having a really hard time sorting out whether people are showing up or participating or following rules because they want to be following rules, or whether they're coerced in some way to follow rules. And I think, Mary Beth, that also gets to your other question about whether or not there are alternatives to those rules, right?
I had a two-finger on this question about the civilian measurement and civilian influence and engagement and these differences, which was just a kind of more of a descriptive data down the line and modeling question, in the sense of, are you going to account a little bit more directly for civilian victimization or the relationship with violence? That for me, when I read it, and even when I saw the presentation, I really, like Adrian, loved the concepts that you had, but I was surprised that there wasn't a little bit more of some of the standard information we might think might mediate the effects that you're looking at. And if the narratives you have help you parse out what was going on in terms of violence, and whether that might then proxy sort of forced behavior versus volunteered behavior. And sorry, Mary Beth, if I cut you.
Yes, so I guess coming soon is the best thing to say. So the narratives don't have a lot of that information. I plan to rely on kind of existing data for the individual conflicts. I mean, there's some of it in there, but again, it tends to be kind of one-off reports. So the systematic stuff will probably be more useful, but you're absolutely right. So as I kind of build out my measures of legitimacy, that's going to be a central component. How bad the group was, what they were doing to civilians living under them.
I think too, I don't know if you want to go down this route, but just thinking about, you know, the different types of ways in which they're using law and order. So I know, for instance, like the provisional IR would have very strict rules, you know, about how they would treat antisocial behavior and things like that. But when it came to informers, it was kind of like, all right, like we're just going to execute them, you know, and there wasn't really a judicial process. So I think to Cassy's point, right, how they deal with the civilian population might be a little bit different than, or just certain types of crime, if you will, versus other types of crime that basically threaten their, you know, livelihood, for lack of a better word.
Yeah, and that information I do have, right? So to the extent that I could parse it out, I have information on the targets of different types of processes and then the punishments that mapped on to different types. It's the systematic nature is a little bit questionable because again, for many of these groups, I'm getting kind of one-off news reports and things like that. So I know that a rebel was executed. I don't know that they always executed rebels across all of my cases, but this is, I mean, to your point and to Michael's point, an opportunity to dig into some of the case narratives better. So I have some good data on Northern Ireland as well as Nepal and then this survey on Turkey. So those are kind of the 3 cases, at least in my head, that I'm going to play around with in order to tease out some of these mechanisms more specifically.
Also, I'll just note when we were talking about some of the data side stuff, we did have a question from Liana Reyes who asked a descriptive question about the data. Does information on codification include rules that are not written by the group, but co-opted and interpreted from religious texts?
The answer is yes. So I have information on that, and it's less about, so it's about the rules that are being enforced through the institution. So it's not about the rules in which the rebel group is using to govern itself. It's about the rules that are actually, whether or not there are rules that map onto the judicial process. And those can be Sharia, those can be rules that adhere to Sharia law, they can be local traditional rules, they can be, I mean, there's a number of Maoist groups in particular that actually write their own code of conduct and have a functioning description of how their courts actually proceed, and that's included too.
So we are approaching the end of our hour together. If any of the discussants have a final big comment that they just want to put out there, do it now or forever wait till email. And we will close. I don't see anyone jumping into the screen. So let me just say thank you to all of you. Great talk, great presentation, Cyanne. This is a really interesting paper. I had a few people comment just to say thank you, great presentation, and great discussion. So all of this will be posted online in the Peace Science Society website under the Colloquium tab, like I said earlier. You can watch this video, you can assign it to your students, you can watch it in your PJs or do what you would like. We have more presentations coming up this semester, which we will announce soon. I don't have the schedule right in front of me, but check back and make sure all your friends are on the Peace Science listserv so that they get our announcements. So that's it for us today.
Cassy, can I just jump in and thank you so much for fighting the good fight and keeping the Colloquium going at this time. This has really been an absolute pleasure. Adrian, Michael, and Mary Beth, thank you so much for your comments. I actually feel like I had intellectual engagement with my peers, which I have not felt this summer as I missed both ISA and APSA. So thank you for that. I really appreciate it, guys.
Thank you. We're so glad that we can have good papers and good discussants. So thank you all very much. And hopefully we'll see you again sometime soon. Maybe I'll just keep asking you back over and over to Peace Science.
Thanks
Well,
so
that's
much.
it for us today. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Cheers.